Edwards, who will be kind of starting us off as a national expert and speaker on NIST and DFARS compliance, specifically around Office 365 and Azure. He is a national speaker across multiple conferences. Specifically, he'll be at SIA here coming up shortly in DC. And also, too, he won't be a speaker, but will be around for the AUSA annual meeting in DC coming up, I believe, next month. He's a graduate of West Point and has a Master's of Information Security from James Madison. He's president and managing partner of Summit 7 Systems. Next, following Sky and also chiming in throughout the presentation today, Todor Batchvarov is a senior program manager for Azure Government Engineering and lead of the CSP program for government. All of this, of course, with Microsoft. For several years, at Microsoft, he has worked across security devices and cloud, and currently focusing on the cloud platform for U.S. government. Also, a little tidbit of information about Todor. Didn't know this, but he is a certified gymnastics judge and does triathlons for fun. Keyword or words for fun. So without further ado, I will hush and let Sky and Todor take it away. And yeah, thank you guys.
Thank you, Sean. I appreciate you having me here, and thank you everyone for joining and taking the time and talking to us, letting us share a bit of information. Very excited to give you the Microsoft side of things and our great partnership with Summit 7. So appreciate everyone's time today.
So today we're going to cover a number of agenda items. Specifically, we're going to start talking about the DFARS 7012 and NIST 171 updates, jump into some trends that we're seeing in the defense industrial base, followed by some updates on the FAR, and some defense industry news. So first thing, with the NIST and DFARS update, if you remember back in our last webinar, we talked about in, I guess it was late April or May, we talked about the two documents that had just been released in draft form, the DoD guidance for reviewing SSPs and the assessing the state of a contractor's internal information system. Both of those are still in draft. They accepted comments up to May 31st. And they did receive 13 different comments, mostly from large organizations, a couple comments from small organizations. But they did get those comments, and they are weaving those comments into the final versions of those documents that we're expecting in the next month or so. So as soon as those come out, you'll see information that we'll put out on blogs about the final versions of those documents, which we're all very interested to get our hands on. And then finally, we had on August 15th, a presentation was done for the Pentagon, specifically about how to protect DoD's unclassified information. In there was an interesting tidbit about DCMA actions. Specifically, DCMA is saying that they're going to encourage the industry to verify that their SSP and POAMs are in place, and that they want to facilitate the entry of government assessment teams into contractor facilities via coordination with the government and with the contractors. The reason I pulled this piece out is because it is interesting that DCMA 1 is talking about this, because DCMA and DSS have been picking up various pieces of the assessment arm as they're looking to more codify how they're going to do assessments of the defense industrial base. And specifically, that DCMA is going to be working to facilitate entrance of, quote, government assessment teams into contractor facilities. So that does mean that they are looking very specifically at having either government employees or government contracted assessors go into industry facilities to assess the compliance with NIST 171 and or the DFARS clause. They have said in other places that they are not going to be looking specifically at NIST 171, but more looking at DFARS compliance in that you have an SSP and a POAM. So we'll see how that modifies over the next few months. So next, I want to cover some DIB trends, some defense industrial based trends that we're seeing. First, I wanted to call out that this is going to be a marathon. This is not an action that we're going to be able to put in place and kind of walk away from it. all of this is going to take continuous effort. This is now a way of doing business. Security is no longer going to be something that can be just talked to. You have to execute on it. And most companies are starting to get that idea. The second thing that we're seeing as we're working with companies is we're running across a lot of companies still. I would say, this is a number I'm kind of pulling out of a hat just based on, customers that we're dealing with. About 30% of the customers that we're dealing with that are coming to us and we're having active conversations with still do not have a system security plan and a plan of action or milestones. Given that requirement was December 31 to have those in place, it is very interesting that we're still seeing that. So obviously we're helping customers get there, but got to make sure that you have that SSP and POAM in as a minimum. The next bullet there on prime contractors, we are seeing RFPs go out from prime contractors, where prime contractors are looking to hire cybersecurity teams to go out and do assessments on their supply chains. So this is a big deal because now the prime contractors are getting involved because their contracts are being impacted by their supply chain and by their subcontractors. And so they're wanting to make sure that their subcontractors are meeting the compliance requirements and are securing the CUI and ITAR kind of content on their contracts. So that's a very interesting development that we've seen take place over the last 2 months, is really when we started seeing the prime contractors put out those RFPs. On GCC High versus commercial, most companies now are moving to GCC High. Now that the small company limitations have been removed, we're seeing that most companies, when given the choice between GCC High or Office 365 Commercial, they are primarily moving into GCC High. However, there are still some holdouts that are staying in commercial or are migrating into commercial, primarily due to feature availability in GCC High, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get down to the roadmap. We're seeing sub 2,000 employee companies largely moving all in. What I mean by that is they are moving their entire organization, their entire company into GCC High instead of having split organizations like the next bullet talks about with larger companies, where they're putting hybrid implementations in place for Office 365 Commercial and Office 365 GCC High. So those architectures that the larger companies are putting in place are obviously more complex, more complicated, and more expensive. But due to the business needs of those larger companies, they sometimes need that to keep their organization split. And so some companies are doing that. We're also seeing smaller companies, what I would put in the 10 to 250 employee range, are heavily leveraging managed services to maintain these environments. Once they get the environment in place, they don't typically have the IT staff to maintain these environments themselves, and so they are leveraging outsourced MSPs to do that for them.
And Scott, if I may chime in, this is definitely, as you said, a trend that we see. GCC High is becoming more and more of a popular platform on the office space, so as in the government space. For Azure, if you consider the small deltas that exist today, our teams internally are accelerating to support partners such as you and your customers to meet those feature demands. Because if I put my head on for any one of these div customers, I would think, well, if I can get the higher compliance now in not having to endure the pain of a migration in the future, I would rather go with High today and deal with that feature gap. So what we're going to be looking at, and we'll talk a little bit about later today, is, as you mentioned, those features that are coming, how we're accelerating to meet them, to adjust to these trends, because it is something that today is a bit of a gap. A few months ago was even a greater gap, but we're looking to minimize it as much as we can.
Great, thanks. Okay, so next I want to talk a little bit about the FAR. So much of what we've been discussing thus far has been based around the DFARS clause, the DFARS need. But there is, the FAR is still hanging out there, the Federal Acquisition Regulation. We've known that the FAR was going to get changed. and it was going to incorporate NIST 800-171 into the FAR. And when that happens, now we're not only talking about DoD contracts, now we're talking about all contracts across the federal government that are going to be impacted by these same security rules. So the technology team report that has been working on this has been extended a number of times. Originally, this technology team report was supposed to be due in February. It's now been pushed all the way out into October. I've been watching it. It's been pushed out, I would say, at least a half a dozen times over the last 8 months. And so we continue to see it be pushed out. But the date of the draft or proposed rule has not changed in the last few months. It's still saying January 2019. So we're expecting that the draft rule for the FAR is supposed to hit in January of 2019 for comment from industry. Now, if you can look at kind of how these things go, they're going to get comments. Then they're going to go back and they're going to make changes, and then we're going to get a final rule, probably sometime in mid to late 2019 with an implementation date, I'm guessing either in 2020 or potentially 2021 is what we're looking at for implementation on the FAR side. This information is primarily based on a call that I had with the FAR procurement analyst that's responsible for this case. I had a phone call with them back in August, on August 23rd, and then there was an open FAR case report that came out on September 14th, which is the date when they pushed the technology team report out to 10/17. So that's only a couple days ago, so that's about as fresh as you can get it, especially with the speed at which some of these rules change. Okay, so that's your update on the FAR for this month. So there's been some interesting legislation that has been signed since we last got together. So there is a new law called the NIST Small Business Cybersecurity Act that was signed on August 14th by President Trump. It requires NIST to do a number of things. Primarily, these things are all around enabling small businesses to get information and to deal with the security controls, the lack of security knowledge within the organization, to help grow that security knowledge, specifically identifying risk, assessing, managing, and reducing risk within their organization. It doesn't mandate anything that has to be done. It's simply that NIST is supposed to provide additional resources to small businesses through the NIST channels to help them identify, assess, manage, and reduce risk from a cybersecurity standpoint within their company. Now, so this doesn't do anything for the business directly. It's not like we're talking about tax breaks or anything like that in this legislation. But what it does mean is that at least there is some visibility into the impact that NIST 800-171 is having, NIST 800-171 and DFARS is having within the small business community. And so it does have that level of visibility, which is great. If we have this kind of visibility that such that we can get a law passed specifically addressing it, even if it's not terribly impactful at this point, it might set the stage for something that could be larger down the road. And so, so the fact that it's being addressed at all is good news. So the next piece I want to talk about is a report that was released back in August by MITRE. I don't know if you're familiar with MITRE, but MITRE is a federally funded research organization. They developed this report for the Pentagon called Deliver Uncompromised, a strategy for supply chain security and resilience in response to the changing character of war. Essentially, it's about asymmetric warfare and how we have to protect our supply chain against asymmetric warfare, which is what we're seeing essentially from Russia and China. And the quote that I have there on the top of the slide, I think, is a really, really key quote. We've got to make sure that we have confidence that industry is delivering capabilities, technologies, and weapon systems that are uncompromised. That is really important. And because of that, they developed 15 or defined 15 different courses of action that they're recommending the government in general and the Pentagon in specific should undertake to help build the deterrence necessary in the asymmetric warfare and asymmetric threats that we're facing from a cybersecurity standpoint. So there's 4 key courses of action that I wanted to highlight out of that, and I'm not going to go through all 15. I'm considering doing a webinar on the entire report and going in detail on all 15. If that's something that you'd be interested in, send something in on the questions or let us know that you'd be interested in seeing that, and we may develop that. We may develop that webinar if it's something you're interested in seeing. But the 4 that I want to cover here, number 1. Elevate security as a primary metric in DoD acquisition and sustainment. We've seen this now from a number of different places. We've seen it from the DoD Inspector General. We've now seen it from this Meyer Report. We've seen it coming out of other acquisition-based organizations within DoD. So this is becoming more and more common as a recommendation from all these reports. So the 3 ways that they wanted to do this was continually measuring risk that contractors present to the federal government. Number 1, by the government on current contractors, by independent, not-for-profit, or federally funded research and development centers. It looked like MITRE was almost asking to become one of those assessors, essentially, as a nonprofit or federally funded research and development center to go out and do, these assessments of the contractor organizations, and then privately, third party by the contractor themselves, through the private sector to do assessments of their own operational risk. Okay. The second one is to advocate for litigation reform and liability reform and protection. Number 1, reducing litigation exposure to encourage reporting. Right now, the Meyer Report said that there's a lot of reticence to bring up and report potential security breaches or security issues that the companies are facing because they don't want to open themselves up to litigation. And so by doing litigation reform, they want to make it so that companies will talk more about the security challenges that they have, the attacks that they're seeing, and get a more community-based policing, if you will, among the defense contractor and the defense industrial base. Second is increasing liability risk for failing a secure system. So on one hand, they're talking about increasing or doing the litigation reform to protect companies from litigation, but on the second hand, they're talking about increasing liability costs. If you don't secure your environment, they want to look at ways to do fines and actually hit contractors for failing to secure their infrastructures. Because when a contractor fails to secure the infrastructure, they fail to secure the CUI, and then that makes the entire system more vulnerable to attack. Third, requiring vulnerability monitoring, coordinating and sharing across the supply chain of command. So the big piece I pulled out of this was the fact that they're looking at creating what they called a vendor vetting database to house relevant acquisition, intelligence, and security information. There's a lot that can be read into that and what that means, but essentially they're looking for a database where where they can go look up vendors and their security status, essentially. The last one is advocating for tax incentives and private insurance incentives. MITRE believes that contractors should be given incentives and tax breaks for embracing supply chain security, embracing these requirements and securing their infrastructure. So that could look a couple different ways. That could look like a couple different things. It could look like actual tax credits based on assessments. It could look like, one of the reasons why we see a difficulty in the contracting world for providing money for providing funding to increase the security stance is that many of the contracts that are out there are done LPTA, lowest price technically acceptable type contracts, and so contractors don't want to raise their rates because you're going to lose a contract if you raise your rates to be able to do the security. And so this is a way that potentially, if they did these tax incentives to allow companies to put these infrastructures in place, the government could continue down the road of doing LPTA because the government is helping on the backside with the tax incentives to put the security infrastructures in place. That's a little bit of my interpretation of it. But if short of doing that, there's going to have to be a change in the contracting methods and how you do contract awards. Like we talked before about having it as a primary metric. Another quote that I pulled out of the report. You can see there, contract determinations are based on cost, schedule, and performance. The goal is to elevate security to be on par with cost, schedule, and performance. And then I put a link there to the report itself. Anyway, that was a very interesting report. And if you guys are interested, I can do a deeper dive on it and pull more information and potentially do a full webinar out of it if that's something that you would like.
Speaking of, I just want to interject real quick and just let everybody know, I just spun up a poll about that webinar concept. So if you would like to see that webinar happen, please just send in a vote, whether yes or no, and that'll kind of help us gauge whether or not we should tackle that.
Great. All right, the next one that we're covering here is the NDIA implementing cybersecurity and DoD supply chains. This came out in July. A couple points that I pulled out of here. There's a large percentage of DIB that is not, and this kind of tracks back to what I was saying about the SSP and POAMs. There's a lot of companies that are still not tracking on DFARS. They're still in their very early stages. Another key point I wanted to pull out. They said that firms in the early stages of implementation are underestimating the cost of implementation by a factor of 10, which is pretty accurate to what we see as we're talking with customers, and we start telling them the different pieces that they have to put in place. Many of them are shocked and have to really kind of gather themselves before they can move down the road. Let's see. The third bullet there, respondents reviewing the DFARS mandate as a requirement for doing business with the DoD rather than something that could be economically justified. This is one of the things that the government really has to change, because right now it is just truly being looked at as a check the box. I have to do this because the government says I have to do it in most cases. And it really has to change from that to a more strategic effort on the behalf of the Defense Industrial Base to look at putting this security platform in place as a multiplier, a capability multiplier for you as an organization, enabling you to win more contracts. And that's how it really has to change. The approach has to change by most companies. And then you see the link there to that specific report. A couple more pieces here. There were, they made recommendations for the three different areas: federal government, prime contractors, and small and medium. A couple I want to focus on here. I'll let you read the rest of that. But a couple I want to focus on here is they want prime contractors to help develop the business case for cybersecurity. Part of that is by having the prime contractors go out and actually do some assessments on their supply chain. By doing those assessments, they can help build the business case, because then they can understand what the small businesses are going through, and then help them develop the appropriate measures to put in place. And then on the small and medium enterprise, that last bullet there, you cannot subcontract out the cybersecurity accountability and responsibility. This was a really interesting point that they made, and it makes sense. You can't subcontract out the responsibility that you have as an organization for cybersecurity in your infrastructure. You can subcontract out the execution of that strategy, but the strategy itself needs to be owned by the C-level within the organization. The C-level has to understand the importance of what's going on here. Okay. Some other interesting news. A number of companies have been barred, have been put on the Pentagon Do Not Buy list. On August 13th, President Trump signed a law that barred the federal government from buying equipment from Huawei and ZTE, both Chinese organizations, Chinese companies. In fact, Huawei and ZTE have actually been kicked out of the PXs as well on military bases, so they're not available to be purchased. That handsets and such are not available to be purchased in by soldiers in PXs either. In 2017, Kaspersky Labs antivirus software was banned from Pentagon use because of suspected spying by the Russian company. And in 2016, there's been a lot of talk about Lenovo over the years. In 2016, DoD issued a warning against Lenovo equipment due to Chinese espionage using firmware and software, specifically on Lenovo laptops inside the Pentagon. And since then, they've basically warned against using Lenovo. I have not been able to find, there's not a law or anything like that that bars the Pentagon from purchasing Lenovo equipment, but there has been a warning and a general avoidance of Lenovo hardware within the DoD over the last number of years. Okay, there was a big security incident, which many of you have probably heard about or heard something about. There was a breach in January, February of this year. It came out in, I believe it was June or July is when it hit the news. There was a contractor for the Naval Undersea Warfare Center that got compromised, and the Chinese stole 614 gigs of material related to the Sea Dragon anti-ship missile and the entire electronic warfare library. Underwater warfare library. That is a big deal, obviously. The content itself was all unclassified, but what was said about the content, because it was so sensitive that once you aggregated all the content together, you could have considered it classified content. There's in one of the articles I was reading about the incident, there was this great quote from the Director of National Intelligence. Most of the detected Chinese cyber operations against U.S. industry focus on defense contractors or tech firms. That's where China is focusing their effort. They're not focusing the effort as much directly on the government organizations as they are on defense contractors and tech firms involved in building the hardware. The weapon systems hardware. That's where they're focusing their efforts these days. The National Cyber Summit. We had the National Cyber Summit here in Huntsville back in June. Dr. Ron Ross was one of the keynotes there. He's the architect of NIST 800-171, so it was very interesting getting to hear him talk. He had some recommendations that I've bulletized here. That we actually had identified some of this earlier in a previous blog post, but I wanted to highlight a few of these blogs, or a few of these real quickly. First, simplify systems. Make sure that you're using traditional systems engineering best practices. You've got to go through requirements processes. You've got to go through design processes. You have to build security into your systems from the ground up. Don't try and put security on a system that is already in place. You got to build it from the ground up. Use systems engineering best practices. The fourth bullet that you see there is moving to FedRAMP cloud services in order to isolate and strengthen protection. So what his point was is that many organizations, especially smaller defense contractors, don't have the resources to manage internal data centers to the level that they need to be managed. So leverage FedRAMP services in order to strengthen the protection that you have for your high-value assets. I thought it was very interesting that he specifically called out the FedRAMP cloud services as a recommendation. And then finally, engineering resiliency. Just like you engineer security into your systems, you've got to engineer resiliency into your system. They have to be able to withstand an attack and continue to run. Otherwise, you're at risk of not only losing data, but also losing the business functionality of your organization. So now we're about to jump into the Microsoft side of it, and I'll bring Todor in here. Todor, thanks for being so patient as I went through that news and those industry pieces. It was a lot of news that hit over the last couple months since the last time we talked. So what I wanted to do here was talk specifically about Office 365 GCC High and Azure Gov, and I wanted to bring this landscape chart up just so everybody kind of has an idea of how these different infrastructures sit in conjunction with one another. So you can notice here, Todor, and I'll let you talk to this a little bit more, but you see Azure Gov there on the right-hand side in the U.S. government cloud. That is your baseline infrastructure. And then you see Office 365 GCC High is built on top of that infrastructure. And so, Todor, do you want to talk to that a little bit about how Office 365 and Azure Gov play together?
Yeah, definitely, Scott. Thanks. And no, I mean, I think all those news definitely give a good context as to how folks should think about and plan for their future implementations. And this comes in very timely because, I mean, what you have out here brings one of the very important conversations that we have with customers and partners like you when you chat with these customers as to how to implement, build, and think about systems. So what you see here is the two big, gray boxes, if I may call them that way, are two different universes. And our cloud infrastructure is unique in its way that we have two completely isolated clouds. When we talk about our commercial cloud versus when we talk about our government cloud, they are physically isolated. There's no logical separations, but rather an actual different fiber, different data center location, etc. So that starts us from the outer ring, so to say, and different services run on these different clouds. So you will see that the commercial cloud and Office GCC, which is our I may call it like more on the not the high version of it, right, with different sets of compliance measures, runs on our commercial cloud. You may ask why did you guys put it out there and whatnot? Well, the commercial cloud is still a highly compliant cloud. It meets a set of compliance measures and security measures. And Office was launched for the GCC SKU before we had implemented our U.S. government cloud. So GCC was born on top of our commercial infrastructure. That one on its own does have logical separations to ensure data sovereignty, safety, integrity. But then when we move a little bit more to the right, everything that's GCC High that does require to meet that, different levels of FedRAMP compliance that require that physical isolation sit on top of our government cloud and beyond. And we'll see on some of the upcoming slides, additional scenarios where this comes in handy.
Great, thanks. I appreciate that. Now Office 365 GCC High is actually FedRAMP High. Their FedRAMP High certification is complete, so they now match FedRAMP High with the Azure Gov FedRAMP High environment. That's great news. The third bullet is one that is new. There is going to be a 10% price increase expected on 1 October. So there's just a couple weeks until that happens. Microsoft is doing, as far as I can remember, and Todor, you may be able to speak to this a little bit, but I don't recall ever having seen a price increase in GCC or in Office 365 at all. I know that new licenses have been released with higher prices and all of that, but I don't ever recall an actual price increase on existing licenses. Has that ever happened before?
Yeah, this is completely new, and this is something that, at least coming on my end, being closer to the Azure side, we have the exact same story. We've never seen a price increase on Azure. It's still that way, but at least on the Office side, you are spot on. It's net new. Arguably the strategy may be differed from what we or our customers may like, but it is something new. It's the first time. It comes bundled with a couple of as we've said, we're trying to grow and accelerate some of these features and bring new capabilities. So as well with a lot of this new compliance measures that are being asked of us to meet. So you'll see some of those benefits, right? And this impacting directly our ability to deliver. But it is something that is out there for the first time. That's right.
Okay, so great. So if you're on the fence and you're about to go into GCC High or into Office 365 at all, it'd probably be a good idea to get that thing closed out in the next couple weeks, so that we can so that you don't get hit with that price increase if you're right on the border. So the next one, the 2 to 6 week SLA for creation of a new tenant. So that is what we typically see. We are seeing the Office 365 team actually deploy those tenants closer to the 2-week time frame these days than the 6-week time frame. So that's great news. The second bullet there on timelines is it's 2 to 4 weeks currently to add licenses to an existing tenant. So, if you have an existing GCC High tenant and you've grown and you need to add licenses to it, you need to leave yourself some time so that and get those orders in, because it does take 2 to 4 weeks to add licenses to an existing tenant. That, I believe, is going to be changing as they continue to improve the management infrastructure around Office 365. And they're looking to get it more closely, closely resembling the CSP infrastructure, where it can be done through a portal. But as of today, it is still a manual process and does take 2 to 4 weeks to get licensing added. We're seeing it closer to the 2-week time frame. And obviously, we're not yet at feature parity with Office 365 Commercial, but we're getting a lot closer. And there's going to be a lot of changes just in the next few weeks with GCC High, and I'll talk about those here in just a second. So, Todor, I wanted you to talk to this slide, if you would. This is a map of the Office 365 data center infrastructure. Would you just kind of give everybody a little bit of an overview of this?
Yeah, definitely, Scott. And one thing to keep in mind, all of our online services, are based on our Azure footprint. When we look at GCC High, which is SKUs and services particular for the U.S. government and U.S. Government-related contractors and customers, we look at our infrastructure in this way. You'll see in some of the feature slides that we have a very similar map as to where Azure sits. So we share a lot of the infrastructure for that. And the reason why we're located like that, of course, we're looking to create that reliability. So we have failovers in place. They are located in areas where we consider are big hubs for companies, and so that you can minimize that latency. We have the redundancy in place. So the way that all these data centers, both for Office and Azure, are built is that they usually go in pairs. So while you can fail over, from the East Coast to the West Coast, there's always we call it a sister data center, right? That will be sitting very close, that whether you have designated something for your disaster recovery or not, you will always have an ability to spin up in a matter of seconds in its sister region and minimize the impact to your availability of service. Now, from our end, our personnel that works with all of these, both in Office as well as Azure, and there are folks that are cleared, that have the ability to work on them. They're U.S. persons. We don't outsource any of this to anywhere outside of the U.S. And even if I think about myself, I do not have access to customer data. If I wanted to, I would have to go through escort sessions and have people looking over my shoulder that are clear, that can attest of what it is that we're doing, and that is only for resolving a customer issue. So all of these areas, the way that they're built, engineered, as well as secured, even from a physical perspective, is highly tight and present across our suite of online services.
Great, thanks, Todor. That's good stuff. So now to talk a little bit about feature availability targets. The roadmap that Microsoft has released thus far has a number of things that are supposed to hit just in the next few weeks. We're getting really close to the beginning of fourth quarter 2018. Knowing that the 2018 roadmap has these items on it, that means that we've got a lot of stuff that's going to be hitting here very shortly. We know things like the Azure Active Directory domain join. We know that's going to hit October 1. That's pretty much public knowledge at this point. So we're very excited about that coming to the table. We're expecting the MTune mobile application management policies to hit, the AIP policies, auto classification, and hold your own key to hit. Teams should be this quarter as well. And then in 2019, we're looking at the cloud voice capabilities, and then Power Apps, Flow, Planner, and Forms. Once we get through those 8 or 9 features, we're going to be really, really close to feature parity with what's in Office 365 Commercial. And that 2019 roadmap, those pieces are supposed to be in the first half of 2019. Those are not last half features. So we're getting really close to having the feature parity that we all need, both from a security standpoint, but also from a collaboration and functionality standpoint. You have anything to add to that, Todor?
No, I think you're spot on. And I mean, I was monitoring the questions as well, and folks are asking about a couple of, hey, when will we see, voice and Skype and features like that? So yeah, definitely. I mean, 2019 is what we're seeing as you mentioned, is a big year for Office. On our end, I mean, coming from Azure, we see Office has a suite of products that come with it. And the Azure side, it's easier. We kind of look at our infrastructure and we move service by service, get them compliant and so on. But that's really one of those main roadblocks here, what keeps us from moving faster, which is, hey, you want to make Office compliant to running GCC High and get it to FedRAMP. It's literally service by service and product by product, which is what pushes all these dates out. We've gotten a compliance team that supports Microsoft as a company and supports you folks that are on the call through Summit 7 that can help make a lot of these services available to you from a compliance standpoint. They've automated the way that they meet controls, so we're really starting to move faster as to how we meet the controls for FedRAMP on each of these services. So we have these dates that are out there. We're always looking to bring them a little bit in. So I do expect that Q1, Q2 of 2019 to be a big quarter for Office to deliver some of these.
Great. Also, there was a question that came in about Dynamics 365. The first portions of Dynamics 365 and GCC High are supposed to hit in the last quarter of 2018 as well. So that's good news on the Dynamics 365 side. All right, Todor, I'm going to hand this to you for the next couple slides to shoot through on the Azure piece. We have 10 or 15 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we were able to get through these slides. So could you kind of walk us through the Azure Gov infrastructure a little bit? I know that a lot of the people that are online, because I know a lot of the people that are in the webinar, and we've been working with them on GCC High in many cases for 6, 9, in some cases a year or more. And some of them have Azure implementations and some of them don't. And so it's really good for them to kind of hear what Azure Gov brings to the table and how it can help from a compliance standpoint. Mm-hmm. But also for everyone to understand that if you have Office 365 GCC High, you have Azure Government. It's just a matter of deploying a subscription and then moving workloads. Your tenant is there. It's created. It's just there for you to use at that point. So Todor, could you talk to us a little bit more about Azure Government?
Yeah, for sure, and I'll go through a lot of these slides, a little bit in a swift manner to allow for some questions at the end. But you've hit it, on the nail on the head by saying if you have GCC High, you have Azure Government, because basically your Office GCC High tenant is created on the Azure Government infrastructure. That's why what you see here in terms of being a physically separated instance, it meets all the requirements above and beyond what the federal government and civilian government, as well as parts on the DoD and in intelligence areas require. We have a large set of standards that we'll see in just a slide or two, and tools and services continue to arrive in there. So if you are today on your, running on-prem perhaps, or running on a hybrid scenario, or even running on Azure Commercial, this is something that you may consider. Azure Commercial as well as Azure Government, they both, have different compliance standards. I mean, if we look at FedRAMP, we meet FedRAMP moderate on Azure Commercial. Once we go into Government, we meet IL4 and IL5, and again, it becomes a matter of choice and of need. But if you are, as Scott was saying even earlier for Office, on the fence as to where to go, or you want to right off the bat, be on a FedRAMP compliant infrastructure, if that is what your contract requires, then going into the Azure government IaaS services and PaaS services, all of those that are published and available are meeting the FedRAMP IL4 and IL5 compliance needs. So it's definitely a great place to start. Can we move to the next slide, please? There we go. And this map, as you see, it's fairly similar to what we saw earlier. We have today a lot of regions that are already lit up. Here you see 8 regions from a government perspective. 6 are online, 2 that are going to be at an IL6 level, so secret that has been announced, and of course our 8 express route sites. I mean, express route is something that allows you to work and be very closely connected with a dedicated connection to the data center and to Azure. So if you have those high intensity, compute heavy, perhaps you're maybe leveraging high performance computing. Express route is something to think about, and that's available, if and whether you're working through Azure or through Office as well. But what are some of those numbers? I mean, I think people often ask us, well, how is Azure, moving and performing? Well, you can see we're continuing to invest in both the infrastructure as well as the services that come to it. As of right now, we have more than 7,000 customers. Some of a great sample is the body cam vendors that run with it, that support public safety. Not only do we safeguard the data, but we actually, leverage high quality video streaming live type of scenarios. So it just goes to show what are some of the capabilities that the platform has, that when used in conjunction with some of the services that your partner Summit 7 can provide, it becomes a great solution that can lead you to solve your mission needs, whether it's for the government, for a particular scenario that they're trying to build, or even if you're experimenting but have need to secure data at this level. And we talked about compliance and what does it mean. I think a lot of you are here because we talk about ITAR, we talk about DFARS. So all of these are present across our different clouds. The regional ones that we won't necessarily cover, as those don't apply, but across our global infrastructure and in the U.S. government specifically, these are some of the highest level of compliance measures that we meet, with more to be added. We also talk about SIGIS, which is a state-specific on the public safety type of information. Not that it will necessarily affect you, but it is something to consider if you ever do have SIGIS needs. Those grow almost at a bi-weekly basis. We've been certifying state by state, and so the same goes for the different new compliance measures that arise. So we've talked briefly about our blueprint team, which is a team that helps us to get to these compliance needs. If you ever run into a scenario where you have questions about these controls, work through Scott and the team, and we can get some of these experts on our blueprint team available to you to help you understand some of these needs. So please leverage Scott and team to get to us, and we can bring more information on this if needed. And again, I won't necessarily go very deep in this, as this is very similar, just to give you an idea of what are some of the customers that we get on our platform through our partners. You'll see the Defense Industrial Base, which is one of our main ones, due to the way that we meet those export controls and CDI and DFARS and so on. So please let us know if you want to deep dive into any of these specifically. And we have a rich amount of online resources for you to leverage and to just get informed as to what's available out there in the cloud, and specifically on the different sets of infrastructure.
Todor, I have a question for you.
Sure.
On the Azure Secret environment, we have a lot of companies on the call today who do have facility clearances, are being managed by DSS. And I've been getting questions about, hey, can we move into that secret Azure region? how is Microsoft allowing defense contractors into that secret Azure region at this point?
So this is something that I mean we I cannot necessarily talk openly about it on the call, but what we could do is through you, Scott, and your customers, we can schedule a specific briefing to really talk about the requirements that your customer has, and we can go from there. I think right now, yeah, what we've said is we've announced the region, it's coming, and we're working through that specific scenario. So please let me know. We'll be more than glad to have a conversation, whether it's online or we can, visit you, or we can bring you folks into our Reston facility that we can do a briefing specific around this topic.
Great, thanks. All right, I think we have one more slide, and then we're going to get the roadmap, and that should wrap up the slides. So
yeah, definitely. And on this one, I mean, again, we talked briefly on the office as to how it is that we support our data centers from both physically all the way until logically as to what systems are in place. So if folks have any specific questions, as I said, I think the key one to call out here is everyone that works on the entire pipeline of the data is covered by some layer of security. So again, we can go in detail if needed, but keep that in mind.
Great. All right, so these are the secret regions. We can schedule something to talk about those if anybody has any questions on that. What I really wanted to get to is this slide, the Azure Gov roadmap. There are a number of features that are currently in preview. Azure Batch AI, Cognitive Services, and Azure Lab Services are all in preview right now within Azure Government. And then that list of future availability, that's a huge amount of capability and feature set that is currently on the roadmap for various regions within Azure Gov. So there's a lot going on there. Todor, do you want to add any flavor to this slide here? Talk about what's coming.
Yeah, one that we are very excited about is Kubernetes, because we are seeing, and the reason why you see all of this popping up is, first, again, goes to show our commitment to the platform, and second, we are really seeing a shift of what our customers need. We're starting to almost move away a little bit from the basic lift and shift, because a lot of our customers have met that. So now we're going really into PaaS services and really into those data analytics and machine learning and AI. So that's the trend that I want folks to pick up from this slide as to what is really the next big area of focus for our platform as well as for customers. So you'll see a lot of this land in the next year. Our fiscal year runs not necessarily aligned to the government, but we run from July all the way through June. So we are currently in the midst of delivering a lot of these. So you'll see them light up shortly, and we'll be, if you're on the platform, you'll see the announcements out there. If you're not, please, again, work with Scott and team to get out there and learn more about when these are landing, in case they're needed for your mission.
Great, thanks, Todor.